One question I've always been asked ever since I started this YouTube channel is how does the wet on wet process actually work when it goes against so many traditional rules of painting, including the fat over lean rule? Well, in this video right here, I'm gonna try my best to explain it from a scientific standpoint and an artist standpoint, all while trying to explain it to you like you're five. So that way we're all on the same page. This is an important video, so buckle up because here we go. The wet on wet painting technique works despite appearing to go against the traditional fat over lean rule because of a few different key factors that all work together to carefully manage how your paint layers dry and adhere to each other. So what is the fat over lean rule? Let's get that out of the way. The traditional fat over lean rule states that each successive layer of oil paint should contain more oil or fat than the layer beneath it. This ensures that the lower layers dry faster and don't cause the slower drying oil-rich upper layers to crack as they dry or contract over time. While the fat over lean principle is important to traditional painting to avoid cracking, flaking of paint, and proper layering, artists like Bob Ross, Bill Alexander, and even Thomas Kincaid use the wet on wet method to bypass the risks associated with the traditional fat over lean rule. Now that we got the traditional rule out of the way and you understand it, we can now talk about why the wet on wet technique works, and it's all due to a few key factors. Let's start with thin layers on top of thick layers. When Bob Ross uses the wet on wet technique, the first layer is usually a thicker and oilier base, using mediums like liquid white and liquid clear, which stay wet and slick for extended periods of time. However, the subsequent layers of paint that will be applied on top are often very thin. These thinner layers, although lean, which is less in oil, sit on top of the thicker oil-rich base. Because they are applied so thinly, they dry relatively quickly compared to the thicker base. Next, we're going to talk about the control of oil content in paint. Even though the top layers of Bob Ross's method seem leaner, which is less oil content, than the underlying wet base, they still adhere because of the following. You first have to remember the base layer has been prepared with enough oil, aka fat, to allow smooth blending. The top layers often use less medium or are mixed minimally with oil, so they dry faster than the thicker base. The idea of a thin paint sticks to a thicker paint means that the more flexible base supports the thin, lean paint on top without cracking. Let's move on to the flexibility of the base layer. The fat base layer in wet on wet painting is flexible as it dries. You need to remember that. The slow drying base coat means it remains soft and pliable for a longer time, reducing the risk of cracking even as thinner layers dry on top of it. The thicker, oil-rich underpainting contracts more slowly as it oxidizes, so the top layers, which are leaner and dry more quickly, don't experience tension that could lead to cracking. This right here is one of the most important. All right, let's move on to minimal layer buildup. In the wet and wet technique, the layering is relatively shallow compared to traditional oil painting methods that involve many layers over time. Since the upper layers are kept thin, they don't build up enough thickness to introduce significant tension or stress on the underlying layers. This can help prevent cracking issues that can occur when thick, lean paint layers dry faster than oil-rich layers below. Moving on to slow drying for proper blending. You need to remember oil paint dries by oxidation, a process that allows for extended working time. This gradual drying allows the different paint layers to bond chemically while remaining pliable. With wet and wet, this long open time gives the layers enough time to adhere before they start to dry and harden. Surface tension between wet layers helps create a smooth adhesion process. The upper layers of paint, especially if they are applied thinly, bond to the surface of the still wet underpainting before oxidation locks the structure in place. This leads into interlocking drying. The slow drying of the underpainting and the relatively faster drying of the lean top layers allow them to dry together evenly. Key word here, evenly, forming a cohesive film as the oxidation process progresses. This avoids the cracking issues that would occur when layers dry unevenly. Another key important reason and factor. I also want to touch on the major factor that is known as paint adhesion. Paint adhesion follows many of the same key points that we made earlier, but it also has some unique ones when we talk about why does the wet on wet technique even work. One of the main things that you need to remember is our liquid base layer coat is also acting as a bonding medium. Because of this, the paint particles have the ability to sit on the base coat rather than mixing into it too much, preserving both adhesion and definition. You can't talk about paint adhesion when it comes to wet on wet without mentioning mechanical bonding via your brushes and knife strokes. When we use our tools like our paint brushes and our palette knives, we are creating a form of mechanical bonding through pressure and texture. Let's start with the palette knife. When Bob uses the palette knife to apply thicker strokes of paint, such as for mountains or tree trunks, the knife pressures the paint into the wet base layer, ensuring it adheres strongly. The knife's physical action actually pushes the upper paint layer into the base, creating a form of mechanical bonding that ensures the paint sticks and doesn't slide off. When we talk about paint brushes, with the right pressure, the brush creates a subtle texture on the wet surface, which helps the paint layers adhere. The soft under layer acts almost kind of like a cushion, allowing the paint to stick, bend, and blend, but still holds enough texture for adhesion. While I don't think it's as important with today's manufactured paints, it's also still worth noting that paint formulation can play a strong role with the wet on wet technique. The paints used in the wet on wet technique are typically formulated to stay wetter for longer. Take for example the Bob Ross paints, which contain a balance of drying oils that allow them to be worked for an extended period of time on a canvas. While the base remains workable for blending, the thin layers of paint applied on top start to dry faster due to a few things. First of all, the paints are going to have less oil content in them. And also, you're generally going to put the layers to be more thinner on top as well, which is going to allow for oxidation to happen, which is the drying process for oils. When this occurs, it's going to be more effective and more efficient. Even though the technique might appear to contradict the fat over lean rule, as well as other traditional rules for painting, the careful balance of layer thickness, oil content, and drying times ensures proper adhesion, resulting in a durable, flexible, and smooth finish for your awesome painting. Oh man, you have no idea how much time and effort I put into this video, researching every little thing, so that way you understand why the wet on wet technique even works, even though it appears to go against so many traditional rules like the fat over lean rule. If you liked all my effort and you liked all my research, you can pay me back with a huge favor. Give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below, and if you really like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can also help me by watching some of my other videos or checking out my book in the video description below, where I help you start your journey on selling your art. I gotta take a break. I'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks for watching, and of course, peace.